from whoever else was in her house. The check bounced. I held the phone to my ear, watching a pair of blue jays bicker over the bird feeder in the garden. "Which check, Sarah?" "My consulting retainer," she choked out. "I tried to deposit it this morning. The teller said the issuing account has a hard freeze." "Mom, the tuition for Leo's academy is due by 5 o'clock today. The automated draft is going to hit my account at noon. If it bounces, Mark is going to get a notification from the bank. He manages the alerts." "Then you should likely call Mark and tell him the truth before noon," I said calmly. "I can't," she sobbed, the panic finally breaking through. "He'll look at the statements. He'll see the history. He thinks my consulting fee is going into a private investment account for the boys' college fund. If he finds out I've been using it to pay the mortgage and the credit cards because we're completely broke—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of her deception was too massive to articulate. "You have been lying to your husband for 3 years to subsidize a lifestyle you cannot afford," I observed, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The truth always arrives eventually, Sarah. It is usually best to greet it at the door yourself." "Mom, please, just this once," she begged, her voice dropping to an agonizing whisper. "I know David is going to prison. I know he ruined everything. But please, transfer $12,000 to my account, just to cover the draft. I'll sell my car. I'll get a real job. I promise I'll pay you back. Just don't let Mark find out today." I closed my eyes. The ghost of the mother I used to be, the enabling, exhausted, silent savior, rattled the cage inside my chest. It was muscle memory. For 35 years, my immediate response to a weeping child had been to write a check, to absorb their consequences, to protect them from the pain of their own actions. But I thought of the Sunday dinners. I thought of the way she looked right through me when she spoke, her eyes always calculating what she could extract next. I thought of the absolute certainty she possessed that my role on this earth was simply to fund her illusions. "No, Sarah," I said. The silence on the line was profound. It wasn't the shocked silence of a child who had been denied a toy. It was the absolute terrified silence of a woman who has just realized her parachute will not open. "Mom." "I love you, Sarah," I said gently, "but I will no longer participate in your lies. You must face your husband. You must face your life." I hung up the phone. I did not block her number. I did not turn off the ringer. I simply set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked away. The phantom weight of her panic tried to follow me into the sunroom, but I refused to carry it. It was not mine. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the local business news websites had picked up the story. I sat at the kitchen island with my iPad, scrolling through the financial columns. Vance Holdings seizes Hayes & Company manufacturing complex. The articles were brutal. They detailed the sudden eviction, the frozen bank accounts, and the rumors of an impending federal investigation into fraudulent collateral claims. Arthur's legacy, built over 4 decades of handshakes and late nights, was dismantled in a single news cycle. It was strange. I thought I would feel a sense of mourning. I thought I would cry for the company that had consumed so much of my youth, the entity that had paid for my home, my children's education, and the food on my table. But looking at the headlines, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. The company was a parasite. It had fed on my silence. It was better dead. At 4:30, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive burst of sound. I glanced out the window. It wasn't David. It wasn't Sarah. Standing on my front porch, holding a sleek leather briefcase, was Mark, my son-in-law. I smoothed my skirt, walked to the door, and opened it. Mark was a handsome man who usually wore an expression of smug superiority, a byproduct of a mediocre career at a mid-tier wealth management firm. Today, however, that superiority was entirely gone. His face was rigid with contained fury. The veins in his neck were visible above the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was tight, vibrating with an anger he was struggling to control. "May I come in?" "Of course, Mark." He stepped inside, completely ignoring the pleasantries he usually weaponized. He didn't take off his shoes. He marched directly into the living room, dropped his briefcase onto the coffee table with a loud thud, and turned to face me. "Where is the money, Eleanor?" he demanded. I paused in the doorway of the living room, folding my hands loosely in front of me. "I assume you are referring to Sarah's consulting retainer?" "Do not play games with me," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "The bank alert hit my phone at noon. The tuition draft bounced. I came home, pulled the statements, and found out my wife has been using a fraudulent phantom salary to pay for our entire life for the last 3 years. "That is correct," I said calmly. "Why didn't you tell me?" he yelled, his composure finally cracking. "You knew!" You sit there in this massive house, playing the sweet, innocent widow, while your daughter runs a financial scam right under my nose. I am a wealth manager, Eleanor. If my firm finds out my own wife has been secretly insolvent, my career is over." "You are a wealth manager," I repeated softly. "And yet you never found it suspicious that your wife was able to afford a private academy, a European vacation, and a luxury vehicle on your salary alone?" Mark flinched. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He knew, deep down, the math had never worked, but he had enjoyed the lifestyle too much to ask the difficult questions. He had chosen willful ignorance, assuming the Hayes family money was quietly flowing in the background to subsidize his ego. "She told me the investments were paying out," he muttered defensively. "And you believed her," I said, "because it was convenient." "That doesn't matter," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "What matters is that the well has run dry. David has destroyed the company. The money is gone. And now I am left holding the bag for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that I didn't even know existed." He pointed an accusatory finger at me. "You're going to fix this, Eleanor," he demanded, his voice dropping into a threatening register. "You have millions in liquid assets from Arthur's estate. You are going to write a check to cover the debt, and you are going to pay the tuition for the boys. If you don't, I am filing for divorce on Monday. I will take full custody, and I will ensure you never see your grandchildren again." I looked at him. He was using the exact same tactics Sarah had used: the deployment of the grandchildren, the ultimate emotional ransom, assuming that a grandmother's love was a weakness to be exploited for financial gain. He waited for me to crumble. He waited for me to gasp, to apologize, to run to my study and produce the checkbook. Instead, I walked over to the coffee table, stood directly in front of him, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You may file the papers whenever you wish, Mark," I said softly, "but you will not receive a single dime." Mark stared at me as if I had suddenly begun levitating. His threat, the ultimate nuclear option of weaponizing the grandchildren, had failed to detonate. He stood completely frozen, his finger still hovering in the air between us, his mind desperately trying to process the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. "You're bluffing," he whispered, though the certainty had entirely bled from his voice. "You love those boys. You practically raised Leo when Sarah was dealing with her issues." "I love my grandsons very much," I agreed, my tone even and quiet. "But I will not be extorted, Mark. And I will certainly not fund a marriage built entirely on financial deception and mutual resentment." "You're going to let me destroy her?" he asked, a cruel, vindictive light flashing in his eyes. "I will take everything in the divorce. I will prove she hid debts. The judge will crucify her. She will have nothing, Eleanor. No house, no car. She'll be living in a rented apartment." "Then she will learn how to live in a rented apartment," I replied simply. "Many people do." Mark's jaw tightened so hard I could hear his teeth grind. He was a man used to bullying his way out of corners, a man who relied on the emotional vulnerability of women to maintain his leverage. Finding a woman who possessed none terrified him. "You're crazy," he sneered, grabbing the handle of his briefcase. "David was right. You've completely lost your mind." "Have a pleasant weekend, Mark," I said, stepping aside to give him a clear path to the door. "And please, tell Sarah she is welcome to call me when she is ready to discuss her future without demanding my checkbook." He didn't reply. He stormed out of the house, slamming the heavy front door so violently the stained glass in the sidelights rattled in their frames. I stood in the silent foyer for a long moment, listening to the roar of his engine fading down the street. A profound, unfamiliar exhaustion settled over me. It was not the panicked, adrenaline-fueled exhaustion of crisis management. It was the deep, bone-weary fatigue of a soldier who has finally set down her rifle after a 40-year war. The collateral damage was immense. The company was gone. David's marriage was collapsing. Sarah's marriage was likely over. The family facade, perfectly maintained for decades, had shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces in less than a week. And all I had done was stop paying the premium on the insurance policy. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. As I raised the glass to my lips, the landline on the wall began to ring. I looked at it. It was the only phone left in the house that I hadn't silenced. I let it ring 3 times, the harsh mechanical sound cutting through the quiet. On the 4th ring, I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" "Eleanor, it's Richard." Richard Vance's voice was crisp, efficient, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. It was exactly what I needed to hear. "Good afternoon, Richard. I assume the eviction is proceeding as planned?" "The local sheriff served the lockout order at 2 o'clock, Richard confirmed. I could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. Your son wasn't there. His assistant tried to argue, but the paperwork was ironclad. We have physical control of the manufacturing equipment. I have an auction house coming in on Tuesday to appraise the heavy machinery. Efficient as always. I don't waste time, Eleanor, but that's not why I'm calling. The typing in the background stopped. There was a brief, uncharacteristic hesitation in Richard's voice. I received a call from the federal authorities about an hour ago, he continued, his tone lowering into absolute seriousness. They flagged the title discrepancy during the bank's emergency audit. The bank is alleging that the collateral documents were forged. They were, I said smoothly. I figured as much, Richard replied with a dry chuckle. Your son is an idiot, Eleanor, but you already knew that. The feds are opening a formal investigation into wire fraud. They are going to subpoena everyone connected to the operating accounts. That includes you as the former owner of the land. I am fully prepared to cooperate with any investigation, I said. I have my own ledgers. I have the original unsigned legacy documents. And I have the forensic proof that the digital stamp used on the bank extension was applied from an IP address registered to the downtown office, a building I have not set foot in for 3 years. Richard let out a low whistle. You really built a bomb shelter before you dropped the match, didn't you? I simply learned to protect my assets, Richard, a lesson my husband failed to teach his son. Well, consider yourself warned. The feds will likely be at your door by Monday. I suggest you have your lawyer present. Whitman and Sterling won't represent you. They are tied to the corporate entity. You need independent counsel. I retained independent counsel on Wednesday, I told him. A former federal prosecutor. He is already reviewing my files. Christ, Eleanor, Richard laughed, a genuine sound of deep masculine amusement. Arthur never stood a chance, did he? You were the shark the whole time. I was a wife and a mother, Richard, I corrected softly. I only became a shark when the water filled with blood. I hung up the phone. The weekend stretched out before me, an endless expanse of quiet hours. No Sunday dinner to prepare, no frantic phone calls to field, no silent, seething resentment to swallow while watching my children divide up my belongings with their eyes. I walked into the living room and sat in my chair. As the sun began to set, painting the walls in shades of bruised purple and dull gold, my cell phone, resting on the side table, vibrated softly. It was a text message. Not from David, not from Sarah. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Hayes, this is Carla, David's assistant. I am so sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call. David has been sitting in his car outside the locked gates of the facility for 3 hours. He won't answer my calls. He won't leave. The security guards Mr. Vance hired are threatening to call the police. I stared at the glowing screen. The image of my son, sitting alone in the dark, outside the gates of a kingdom he had destroyed, a kingdom he never truly owned, flickered in my mind. The instinct to save him, to drive down there, to pay the guards, to bring him home and make him a cup of tea, surged up from the deepest, oldest part of my heart. It was agonizing. It was physical pain. I set the phone down on the table. I did not reply. I sat in the darkening room, watching the shadows swallow the furniture, and allowed the mother I used to be to finally, quietly die. The federal agents arrived exactly when Richard Vance predicted they would. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. There were two of them, a man and a woman, dressed in immaculate, unmemorable gray suits. They stood on my front porch, their badges gleaming dull silver in the morning light, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. I invited them in and offered them coffee. They declined. We sat in the sunroom. My attorney, a sharp, unsmiling man named Robert Sterling, no relation to Arthur's old firm, sat beside me, his briefcase open on his lap. "Mrs. Hayes," the mail agent began, pulling a thick file from his bag, "we are investigating allegations of wire fraud and federal bank fraud connected to the commercial loan extensions filed by Hayes & Company last month. Your son, David Hayes, is the primary focus of this inquiry." He paused, watching my face carefully. He was waiting for the maternal flinch, the defensive posturing, the tears. I simply nodded, my hands folded calmly in my lap. "I understand." The female agent leaned forward. "The bank claims that the collateral listed on the extension, the manufacturing parcels, were authorized by your signature. However, a subsequent title search during the eviction proceedings initiated by Vance Holdings revealed that the land was never legally transferred to the corporate entity. Did you sign the loan extension, Mrs. Hayes?" "I did not," I said. "Do you know who did?" she pressed. "I can only assume my son, or someone acting under his direct orders, utilized a digital replica of my signature without my consent. I have not been involved in the daily operations or the administrative signing of any corporate documents for 3 years." My attorney slid a perfectly bound folder across the small glass table. "Agents," Robert said, his voice smooth and clinical. "You will find inside this folder an affidavit from Mrs. Hayes swearing she did not sign the documents in question. You will also find a forensic audit of the IP addresses used to log into the bank portal where the digital stamp was applied. The IP traces back to the downtown executive offices of Hayes & Company. Mrs. Hayes has not visited that building since her husband's funeral." The agents opened the folder. They scanned the documents in silence. I watched their initial skepticism evaporate, replaced by the grim realization that I was not a suspect to be broken, but a victim who had already meticulously documented her own defense. "Mrs. Hayes," the mail agent said, looking up, his tone significantly more respectful, "if your son forged your signature to secure a multi-million-dollar federal loan, he is facing serious time. Are you prepared to testify to that fact in open court?" The question hung in the air, heavy and violent. To stand in a courtroom, under oath, and testify against my own child, to point the finger that would lock him in a cage. It was the ultimate, unspeakable taboo of motherhood. I looked out the window at the garden. The hydrangeas were beginning to wilt at the edges, surrendering to the impending autumn cold. "I am prepared to state the truth," I replied softly. "Whatever consequences follow the truth are not my doing. They are the result of the actions taken by the man who forged the document." The agents stayed for another hour, collecting my statements and taking possession of the original legacy charter I had retrieved from Arthur's study. When they finally left, the house felt strangely lighter. The threat of legal entanglement, the looming shadow of David's fraud, had been officially severed from my life. My attorney packed his briefcase with precise, economical movements. "You handled that perfectly, Eleanor," Robert said, snapping the locks shut. "They have everything they need to indict him. Your name will be entirely cleared." "Thank you, Robert." "I should warn you, though," he added, pausing at the front door. "Once the indictment drops, his lawyers will likely advise him to seek a plea deal. Part of that strategy might involve him attempting to reconcile with you, to demonstrate family support for a lighter sentence. They will try to play on your sympathies." "I have no sympathies left to play on," I assured him. He offered a brief, grim nod and left. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and a heavy, relentless rain began to fall. The sound of it drumming against the roof and the windows was hypnotic, drowning out the silence of the empty house. At 4:00, the phone rang. It was a local number, but not one I recognized. I almost didn't answer it. But the instinctual awareness that the collapse was not yet complete forced my hand toward the receiver. "Hello? Eleanor, it's Chloe." Her voice was almost unrecognizable. It was stripped entirely of its polished, aristocratic sheen. It sounded raw, wet, and terrified. "Hello, Chloe," I said. "He's gone," she blurted out, a ragged sob tearing through her words. "Eleanor, David is gone." A cold, sharp spike of absolute terror drove itself directly into my spine. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. In the span of a single heartbeat, my mind conjured the most devastating, permanent images a mother can imagine. The locked facility gates, the despair, the sudden end. "What do you mean, gone?" I demanded, my voice suddenly sharp, the detached calm shattering instantly. "He took his passport," she cried, hyperventilating into the receiver. "I came back to the house to pack the rest of my clothes, and his safe was open. His passport is gone. His watches are gone. He emptied the joint emergency account this morning. The bank said he wired it to an offshore holding company." I closed my eyes, the terror instantly mutating into a profound, sickening disgust. He hadn't ended his life. He was running. "He fled," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The feds raided the downtown office 2 hours ago," Chloe sobbed. "Carla called me. They took all the computers. They took the physical files. David knew they were coming." "He must have known they found the forgery." "Yes," I said quietly. "He knew." "What am I supposed to do?" she screamed, the panic escalating into absolute hysteria. "The mortgage is due. The feds are going to freeze everything with his name on it. I have $50 in my wallet, Eleanor. He left me here to deal with this. He left me." She was weeping violently now, the sound echoing through the receiver. She was no longer the arrogant woman who had stolen my jewelry to fund her ego. She was simply a terrified passenger trapped on a sinking ship, realizing the captain had already taken the only lifeboat. "Chloe," I said, my voice steady, cutting through her panic, "listen to me." She sniffled, gasping for air. What? What do I do?" You must call a defense attorney immediately. Explain that your husband has emptied the joint accounts and fled the jurisdiction. You must legally separate yourself from his finances today, or the federal government will hold you liable as an accessory to his flight." "A lawyer?" she choked. "I can't afford a lawyer. He took everything." "Then you will have to sell the diamond tennis bracelet you borrowed from me last month," I suggested mildly. "The one you lost. I imagine the stones will cover an excellent retainer." The silence on the line was absolute. The weeping stopped entirely. "Goodbye, Chloe," I said. I hung up the phone. I walked to the window and watched the rain wash the world clean. The news of David's flight broke on Wednesday morning. It was no longer contained to local business columns. It hit the regional broadcasts. CEO fled state amidst federal fraud probe. Hayes and Company officially bankrupt. The news anchors spoke his name with a grim, practiced severity, displaying a photograph of him smiling confidently at a ribbon-cutting ceremony just 2 years ago. I watched the broadcast in the kitchen, sipping my tea. It felt as though I were watching a documentary about a stranger. The man on the screen, the arrogant, manicured fraud, bore no resemblance to the little boy who used to sit at this very counter, swinging his legs, asking me to help him with his math homework. I realized, with a quiet, hollow sadness, that the boy had died a long time ago. I had just spent the last 20 years pretending the man wearing his face was the same person. By Thursday afternoon, the fallout began to hit the secondary targets. Sarah's husband, Mark, did not wait for the weekend. True to his word, he filed for emergency divorce and full custody of my grandsons, citing Sarah's financial deception and the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her family's reputation. He claimed her proximity to the criminal investigation of her brother made her an unfit guardian. Sarah arrived at my house in the pouring rain. She didn't use her key this time. She rang the doorbell over and over until I opened it. She stood on the porch, drenched, shivering, holding a single, cheap duffel bag. Her designer coat was gone. Her hair was plastered to her face, her eyes swollen and red from days of uninterrupted crying. She looked exactly like she had at 16, the night she crashed her father's car and walked 3 miles home in a thunderstorm to avoid his temper. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice was broken, completely devoid of the entitlement that had defined her adult life. "He locked me out. Mark changed the codes on the house. He won't let me see the boys." I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I did not step aside. "You may come in and dry off, Sarah," I said gently, "but you cannot stay here." She stared at me, the rain dripping from her chin. The words didn't seem to compute. "What do you mean? I don't have anywhere else to go. My credit cards are frozen. The accounts are locked." "You may use the guest bathroom to shower," I repeated, my tone unwavering. "I will make you a hot meal, but you cannot sleep here tonight. You cannot move back into this house." "Why?" she cried, the desperation cracking her voice. "I'm your daughter. I have nothing. Mark took the kids, Mom. Please, just let me stay in my old room until I figure this out. I can't sleep in my car." "If you move into this house, Sarah," I explained quietly, You will never leave. You will revert to the child you were at 16. You will expect me to call lawyers. You will expect me to fight Mark. You will expect me to fund your defense, to shield you from the consequences of the lies you told your husband. I won't, she sobbed, dropping the duffel bag onto the wet porch. I swear I won't. I just need a place to sleep. You need to learn how to survive without me, I said, because I will not be here forever. I stepped aside, finally allowing her to cross the threshold. She walked into the foyer, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor. She looked around the immaculate, silent house, suddenly realizing that it was no longer a sanctuary she could claim ownership of. It was a fortress, and I was holding the only key. I gave her a towel. I made her soup. I sat at the kitchen island while she ate in silence, her hands trembling so badly the spoon rattled against the bowl. When she finished, I slid an envelope across the counter. "What is this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "It is $3,000 in cash," I said. "It is enough for a security deposit on a small apartment, and enough to hire a modest family law attorney to ensure Mark does not completely strip you of your visitation rights." Sarah stared at the thick white envelope. She didn't reach for it. "It is a loan," I added, my voice hardening slightly. "A real loan, Sarah. You will sign a promissory note before you leave this kitchen. If you do not repay me $50 a month, every month, I will take you to small claims court. I will not fund your irresponsibility anymore. But I will give you the tools to begin repairing your own life." Tears spilled over her eyelashes, dropping silently onto the granite counter. For the first time in her life, she wasn't crying because she wasn't getting what she wanted. She was crying because she finally understood the reality of what she had lost. She had lost her mother's blind, unconditional complicity. She reached out and pulled the envelope toward her. "Okay," she whispered. I placed a simple, handwritten contract on the counter along with a pen. She didn't read it. She simply signed her name, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "You should look for an apartment near the boys' school," I suggested softly. "Mark cannot legally keep them from you indefinitely, but proximity will look favorable to a judge." She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She stood up, picking up her wet duffel bag. "Are you ever going to forgive me?" she asked, stopping in the hallway. She didn't look at me. She stared at the floor. "I forgave you a long time ago, Sarah," I replied. "But forgiveness does not mean I have to allow you to destroy me." She nodded again, a small, painful movement. She walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind her. I watched from the window as she walked to her car, the rain still falling in heavy gray sheets. She got in, started the engine, and slowly drove away. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel cruel. I felt only a profound, necessary sorrow. A surgeon does not feel joy when amputating a limb, but she knows it is the only way to save the rest of the body. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up the empty soup bowl, and washed it in the sink. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of endurance. It was the clean, empty silence of a slate wiped completely blank. I dried my hands and walked into Arthur's old study. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, exactly as it had for decades. but the drawers were empty. The legacy documents were gone. The ghost of my husband's empire had finally been exorcised from the property. I sat in his leather chair. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of pristine, glossy brochures I had hidden there weeks ago, long before the jewelry was stolen, long before the final collapse began. They were real estate listings, properties on the coast, small, quiet cottages with wraparound porches overlooking the gray, churning Atlantic. Places where the air smelled of salt and pine, places where nobody knew my name, my history, or the weight of the family I had carried on my back for 40 years. I ran my finger over a photograph of a cottage in Maine. It had a small garden, a stone chimney. I had the money from Richard Vance's wire transfer resting safely in an account completely severed from the Hayes name. I had no debts. I had no dependent children. I had no husband to manage. For the first time in my entire existence, I was terrifyingly, wonderfully free. The process of disappearing is surprisingly bureaucratic. I did not pack my bags in the dead of night. I did not slip away like a thief. I spent the next 2 weeks methodically dismantling my physical existence in the town where I had spent 4 decades. I hired a private estate liquidation company, not Mr. Vance's associates, but a discreet firm from 3 counties over. They arrived on a Tuesday morning with clipboards and colored stickers. I walked them through the house, pointing to the antique credenzas, the Persian rugs, the silver dining sets, and the crystal chandeliers. "Sell it all," I instructed the lead appraiser, a quiet woman with sharp glasses. "Whatever doesn't sell at auction, donate. I want the house completely empty by the 28th. She looked at me, mildly surprised. Usually, widows clung to the artifacts of their past, fighting over the sentimental value of a cracked teacup. But to me, the furniture wasn't history. It was evidence. It was the heavy, suffocating set dressing of a play I had finally decided to quit. I kept very little. I kept my mother's emerald teardrop earrings and the gold herringbone chain, the pieces David had stolen, the pieces that had initiated the final collapse. I kept a small box of photographs from before the children were born, back when Arthur and I were just 2 people terrified of the future. And I kept a single cracked ceramic mug that Sarah had made for me in the 3rd grade, a misshapen, ugly thing painted bright yellow. Everything else was tagged for removal. On Thursday, the real estate agent arrived. He was a young man, hungry for a high-end commission, who walked through the sprawling, echoing rooms of my home with dollar signs reflecting in his eyes. "It's a magnificent property, Mrs. Hayes," he said, tapping his tablet as we stood in the empty sunroom. "Given the neighborhood and the acreage, we can list it slightly above market. The inventory for luxury family homes is incredibly low right now. We could have a bidding war by the weekend." "I am not interested in a bidding war," I said. "I am interested in speed. List it for 20% under market value, cash offers only, 10-day close." He stopped tapping. He looked at me as if I had just suggested burning the house down for the insurance money. "Mrs. Hayes, you would be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table." "I am buying time, young man, not equity. List it as I asked." He swallowed his objections, recognizing the absolute finality in my tone, and nodded. As the physical footprint of my life began to vanish, The legal footprint of my son's disaster continued to expand. The federal authorities officially issued a warrant for David's arrest on a Friday. He had been tracked to a small, non-extradition island in the Caribbean, confirming my suspicion that he had been planning his exit strategy long before the bank audit accelerated his timeline. He had taken everything he could carry, leaving his wife, his employees, and his legacy to burn in his wake. Chloe, predictably, had taken my advice. She retained a vicious divorce attorney who immediately filed an emergency motion to seize whatever domestic assets David hadn't managed to offshore. She went on the local news, playing the part of the naive, betrayed wife, crying real tears for the cameras as she described how the man she loved had deceived her. She was a brilliant actress. If I hadn't known she had worn my stolen diamonds to a charity gala, I might have felt sorry for her. Sarah, to my genuine surprise, kept her promise. On the first of the month, a crisp $50 bill arrived in my mailbox, tucked inside a plain white envelope. There was no note. There was no plea for additional help. Just the money, exactly as we had agreed. I heard through the town's relentless gossip network, a network I no longer actively participated in, but still occasionally overheard at the grocery store, that Sarah had rented a small 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery near the boys' school. She had taken a job as a receptionist at a dental office. Mark was making the divorce brutal, weaponizing his higher income to drag her through endless custody hearings. But Sarah was fighting back. She was no longer hiding behind my checkbook. She was standing on her own feet, taking the blows, and learning how to bleed without asking me for a bandage. It was the proudest I had been of her in 20 years. On a crisp, overcast Tuesday, the moving trucks arrived. I stood on the front porch with a mug of black coffee, watching as men in gray uniforms carried Arthur's heavy mahogany desk out the front door and loaded it into the back of a van. I watched them carry out the dining room table where I had endured decades of silent humiliation. I watched them carry out the velvet sofa where Sarah had wept for her phantom salary. Piece by piece, the weight of the Hayes family was loaded into a truck and driven away to be auctioned off to strangers. By 3 o'clock, the house was entirely empty. The silence inside was no longer peaceful. It was absolute. My footsteps echoed off the bare hardwood floors. The sunlight, unhindered by curtains or furniture, poured through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty air. I walked through the rooms one last time. I stood in the kitchen, running my hand over the cold granite island. I stood in the doorway of the sunroom, looking out at the hydrangeas. I stood in the master bedroom, staring at the exact spot where my jewelry box used to rest on the vanity. I did not feel the crushing grief I had expected. I did not feel the panic of a woman abandoning her post. I felt exactly like a prisoner who had finally served her sentence. My attorney called at 4:30. "Eleanor," Robert said, his voice brisk, "the buyers just wired the funds to escrow. The title is officially transferred. The house is no longer yours." "Thank you, Robert." "Are you sure you don't want me to hold a retainer for you? If David is apprehended and brought back, the feds might want to speak with you again." "If David is apprehended," I said, my voice steady, "he will have to face his consequences alone. I have no further testimony to offer. My involvement in this family's business is permanently concluded." "Understood," Robert said softly. "Safe travels, Eleanor. Enjoy the coast." I hung up the phone. I picked up my single suitcase resting by the front door. I pulled on my coat, locked the deadbolt, and dropped the heavy brass keys into the mailbox for the new owners. I walked down the driveway to my car. I did not look back at the house. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out onto the street. I drove past the country club where Arthur used to play golf. I drove past the private academy where my grandsons went to school. I drove past the highway exit that led to the abandoned, locked gates of Hayes and Company. I drove until the familiar streets faded into unfamiliar highways, and the dense, manicured suburbs gave way to the wild, untamed trees of the northern route. I was heading toward the ocean. I was heading toward a small stone cottage with a wraparound porch. I was heading toward a life where my phone would only ring if I wanted it to, and my name belonged entirely to me. The coastline of Maine does not welcome you. It simply permits you to exist alongside it. I arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon, driving through a dense, salt-heavy fog that clung to the pine trees like wet wool. The property sat on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic, entirely isolated from the main road by a winding dirt driveway. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was frigid, biting through my coat, smelling sharply of decaying seaweed and crushed pine needles. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of the cottage and stepped inside. It was small. It was the exact opposite of the sprawling, cavernous estate I had left behind. There was a single main room with a fieldstone fireplace, a modest kitchen with worn butcher block counters, and a small bedroom tucked under the eaves. The furniture was sturdy, unassuming, and entirely devoid of pedigree. It was perfect. I unpacked my single suitcase. I placed the yellow, misshapen ceramic mug Sarah had made for me on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I placed the velvet box containing my mother's jewelry in the top drawer of the plain pine dresser. That night, I lit a fire in the hearth. I sat in a faded armchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, and listened to the ocean violently assault the rocks below the bluff. It was a chaotic, angry, magnificent sound. It drowned out the silence. It drowned out the memories. For the first week, my body rejected the peace. I woke up every morning at 5 a.m., my heart racing, adrenaline surging through my veins, conditioned by 40 years of anticipating the next crisis. My mind would frantically search for the problem I was supposed to solve. Who needs money? Who is angry? What lie do I need to cover today? But there was no one. There was only the fire to tend, the coffee to brew, and the gray, churning sea to watch. Gradually, the panic began to subside. I bought groceries at a small market in the village 3 miles away. The cashier, a teenager with bright blue hair, did not know my last name. She did not know I was the widow of Arthur Hayes. She did not know my son was an international fugitive, or that my family's legacy had been dismantled by federal authorities. To her, I was just a quiet woman who bought strong tea and fresh sourdough bread. I became fiercely protective of my anonymity. I changed my phone number, giving the new one only to Robert Sterling, my attorney, with strict instructions to contact me only in the event of an absolute legal emergency. I did not give the number to Sarah. I did not give it to Chloe. If they needed to reach me, they could write a letter to a P.O. box I had rented in the village. 2 months passed. The harsh New England winter arrived, burying the cottage under 3 feet of snow. I spent my days reading books I had never had the time to read, learning how to bake bread from scratch, and watching the brutal, unforgiving beauty of the winter storms. I did not miss them. That was the most terrifying, liberating realization of all. I did not miss my children. I did not miss the noise. I did not miss the constant, draining performance of motherhood that society had demanded I maintain until my dying breath. I missed my grandsons occasionally. I missed the way Leo used to laugh when I chased him through the garden. But I knew that seeing them meant opening the door to Mark's aggression and Sarah's chaos, and I refused to let that poison back into my bloodstream. In late January, the first letter arrived at the P.O. box. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Sarah's. I took the envelope back to the cottage. I made a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and used a silver letter opener to break the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper and a $50 bill. Mom, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you even check this box. But I wanted to let you know that the divorce was finalized last week. Mark got primary custody. I get the boys every other weekend and Wednesday nights. It broke my heart, but my lawyer said it was the best we could do given the circumstances. I'm still working at the dental office. They gave me a small raise. It's not much, but it pays the rent. I saw Chloe at the grocery store last week. She ignored me. I heard she's moving to Florida to live with her sister. The feds formally indicted David in absentia. They don't think they'll ever catch him. I'm learning how to cook. I tried to make your roast lamb last Sunday. I burned it completely. We ordered pizza instead. Leo said the pizza was better anyway. I'm paying you back, Mom, just like I promised. Sarah. I read the letter twice. I traced my thumb over the slightly smeared ink where she must have pressed too hard with the pen. I felt a profound, bittersweet ache in my chest. She was surviving. She was burning roasts and living in a small apartment and facing the devastating consequences of her actions without a safety net. She was finally, at 35 years old, becoming an adult. It cost her everything to learn the lesson. It cost me everything to teach it to her. I took the $50 bill and placed it in a small glass jar on the kitchen counter. I took the letter, walked over to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. I watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash, carried up the chimney by the heat. I did not write back. A mother's silence had been the weapon that destroyed the illusion of the Hayes family. I was not going to break that silence now, not when it was finally producing the reality they all so desperately needed to face. I walked to the window and looked out at the ocean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so brilliantly clear it hurt the eyes. I picked up the yellow ceramic mug, filled it with hot tea, and stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold, salt-heavy air, entirely alone, and finally, completely at peace. Spring arrives on the Maine coast, not with gentle warmth, but with violence. The ice doesn't melt, it fractures. Massive slabs of it break apart against the rocky shoreline with the sound of distant artillery fire, surrendering reluctantly to the changing season. Inside the cottage, the transition of time was marked only by the glass jar on the butcher block counter. It now held 4 crisp $50 bills. Sarah had not missed a single month. Her letters had grown shorter, less fraught with panic, settling into a quiet, resigned documentation of her new reality. She wrote about parent-teacher conferences, about learning to fix a leaking sink by watching a video online, about the exhaustion of standing on her feet for 8 hours a day. She was surviving. A mother's grief does not always happen at a funeral. Most of the time, we mourn the children we thought we raised long before we are forced to survive the adults they became. I had mourned Sarah. Now I was simply observing the stranger who had taken her place, a stranger I respected far more than the daughter I had spoiled. But a collapsed family is a landscape of landmines. Just when you believe you have safely navigated the perimeter, you step on something buried in the dirt. The padded envelope arrived in my P.O. box on a rainy Tuesday in late April. It was a small manila bubble mailer. There was no return address. The postage was heavily stamped, indicating it had been routed through an international customs hub, though the ink was too smeared to read the country of origin. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the rain drumming against the roof, and stared at the package resting on the passenger seat. I knew I should throw it away. There was a rusted metal trash can sitting directly outside the post office doors. I could roll down the window, drop the envelope into the dark, wet bin, and drive back to my quiet life. Instead, I put the car in gear and drove home. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter next to the yellow ceramic mug. I used my silver letter opener to slice through the heavy packing tape. I turned the envelope upside down. A cheap, black, prepaid cell phone slid out onto the wood, followed by a tangled black charging cord. There was no note. There was no letter of explanation. I stared at the device. It looked ugly and venomous sitting in my kitchen. It was an intrusion, a heavy, dark tether connecting my sanctuary to the burning world I had left behind. I plugged the cord into the wall and attached the phone. The small screen flickered to life, glowing with a harsh synthetic blue light. The battery icon displayed 2%. I did not turn the volume down. I did not throw it in the ocean. I left it on the counter, made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and sat in my armchair by the unlit fireplace, waiting. It took 3 days. The phone rang at 11:14 p.m. on a Thursday. The sound was jarring, a generic electronic trill that cut through the rhythmic crashing of the waves outside. The blue screen illuminated the dark kitchen. I set my book down. I walked slowly across the room, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards. I looked at the screen. Unknown caller. I picked it up and pressed the green button. I brought the cold plastic to my ear, but I did not speak. For a long moment there was only the sound of static, layered over a hollow, echoing background noise that sounded like a crowded room or a busy street. Then a breath. "Mom?" The voice was thin, ragged, and warped by the terrible compression of the international line. But it was him. "Hello, David," I said. My voice was perfectly flat. A choked, desperate sound escaped him, halfway between a laugh and a sob. "You answered. Oh my God, you actually answered. I didn't know if you would. I didn't know if the private investigator actually found the right P.O. box." "You hired a private investigator?" I repeated, processing the information. "I had to," he rushed out, his words stumbling over each other. "I had to find you. Chloe changed her number. The lawyers won't take my calls. You're the only one left, Mom. You're the only one." He sounded completely feral. The arrogant, manicured CEO was entirely gone, stripped away by months of running, hiding, and looking over his shoulder. "Where are you, David?" I asked, looking out the window into the pitch-black night. "I can't say," he whispered, his voice dropping into a paranoid hush. "It's not safe. The feds seized the offshore holding account 3 weeks ago. They found the shell company. I don't know how, but they found it. Everything is frozen. I have nothing, Mom. I'm living in a hostel. A fucking hostel." I closed my eyes. The image of Arthur's son, a man who used to complain if a restaurant served him the wrong vintage of wine, sleeping on a stained mattress in a foreign hostel, flickered through my mind. "That sounds like a very difficult situation," I said. "Difficult," he hissed, his panic spiking. "Mom, it's not difficult. It's a death sentence. The people who arranged my papers here, they know I had money. They know who I am. And now that I can't pay the monthly security fee, they're threatening me. They said they're going to take my passport and hand me over to the local police unless I pay them by Monday." He paused, gasping for air. "I need $50,000. There it was, the illusion of a son calling his mother for comfort, shattered, revealing the familiar, ugly machinery beneath. It was never about seeking my voice. It was never about an apology. It was the same transaction, executed from a different time zone. "I don't have $50,000 to give you, David," I said calmly. "Stop lying," he screamed into the phone, the sudden volume making me pull the device slightly away from my ear. "You sold the land to Vance for $8 million cash. I saw the public transfer records before I left. You have millions sitting in an account while I am about to be killed in a third world country." "The money I have is mine," I replied. "It is not an emergency fund for a federal fugitive." "Mom, please," he sobbed, the anger instantly collapsing back into terror. "I'll do whatever you want. I'll pay you back with interest. I'll sign whatever you want me to sign. Just wire it to the crypto address I texted to this phone. Please. If they hand me to the police, the feds will extradite me. I'll go to federal prison for 20 years. You can't let them put your son in a cage." I stood perfectly still in the dark kitchen. I realized with absolute, chilling clarity that he was trying to run the exact same play. He was banking on the maternal instinct to shield a child from physical harm. He believed that no matter what he had done, no matter how deeply he had betrayed me, the threat of violence against him would force me to unlock the vault. He still thought I was the woman who sat at the Sunday dinner table in silence. "David," I said gently. "Yes, yes, Mom, please." "When you opened my jewelry box," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "and you took the emerald earrings that belonged to my mother, did you feel any hesitation? Did you think of me at all?" The line went dead quiet. The static hummed in the background. "Mom, What? He stammered, entirely derailed by the question. Why are you talking about that? I'm telling you, my life is in danger. Did you? I pressed, ignoring his panic. I don't know, he cried defensively. It was business. I was trying to save the company. It wasn't personal. That is exactly the problem, David, I said softly. It was never personal to you. I was never a person to you. Mom, I need the money. You forged my signature to a federal document, I reminded him. You attempted to legally declare me mentally incompetent to steal my assets. And when your fraud was discovered, you abandoned your wife and fled the country. You are a criminal, David, and federal prison is exactly where criminals belong. You're going to let them take me? He whispered, the absolute horror of the realization choking his words. You're my mother. I was your mother, I corrected. Now I am simply a woman who bought a burner phone. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I could hear his voice, tinny and frantic, screaming my name through the small speaker. I pressed the red button. I did not turn the phone off. I did not throw it away. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up the heavy yellow ceramic mug that Sarah had made me, and brought it down on the black plastic screen with all the force I possessed. The screen shattered with a sharp crack. I struck it again and again until the casing splintered, the battery dislodged, and the synthetic blue light died entirely. When you finally sever a necrotic limb, the first sensation is not pain. It is the shocking, dizzying lightness of the body that remains. I stood in the dark kitchen, the heavy yellow mug still gripped tightly in my right hand. My breathing was slow and even. The burner phone lay scattered across the butcher block counter in jagged pieces of black plastic, shattered glass, and exposed copper wiring. I did not weep. I did not feel the sudden, crushing guilt that society demands a mother feel when she abandons her child to the wolves. I felt only the clean, surgical finality of a locked door. I set the yellow mug down. It had sustained a small hairline fracture near the handle from the force of the impact, but it remained intact. It was stronger than it looked. I swept the pieces of the shattered phone into a metal dustpan, walked out onto the back porch, and deposited them into the heavy iron trash bin. I stood there for a moment, letting the freezing ocean wind wash over my face. The storm inside my history had finally blown itself out. There was nothing left for me to manage. The news of his arrest arrived 3 weeks later. It did not come through a frantic phone call or a knock at the door. It arrived quietly, through the small television I kept in the corner of the sitting room, while I was knitting a gray wool blanket. Fugitive CEO apprehended in extradition sweep. I stopped knitting. The needles rested silently in my lap. The news footage was grainy, shot from a distance outside a federal courthouse in Miami. The camera zoomed in on a man stepping out of a black SUV, flanked by 2 towering U.S. Marshals. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit. His wrists were chained to a heavy leather belt at his waist. It was David. He looked entirely unrecognizable. His hair, usually styled with expensive product, was overgrown and graying at the temples. He was noticeably thinner, his face drawn and hollowed out by months of paranoia and poor sleep. As he walked toward the courthouse doors, he stopped. He turned his head and looked directly into the mass of flashing press cameras. His eyes were wide, panicked, and desperately searching. He was looking for someone in the crowd. He was looking for a lawyer he couldn't afford. He was looking for the wife who had already legally abandoned him. But mostly, I knew, he was looking for me. He was still waiting for the maternal safety net to materialize. He was still expecting the invisible foundation of his life to step forward, pay the bail, scold the authorities, and whisk him away from the consequences of his own arrogance. He stared into the camera for 3 seconds before a marshal placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and shoved him forward through the heavy glass doors and out of sight. I stared at the empty screen. I did not call Robert Sterling to inquire about the charges. I did not search for the prison registry. I picked up my knitting needles and quietly finished the row. He was the federal government's problem now. By late June, the brutal Maine winter had fully surrendered to a brief, glorious summer. The fog lifted, revealing an ocean the color of crushed sapphires. The wild roses along the bluff bloomed in violent shades of pink and white. I was sitting on the porch reading a biography of an obscure Russian poet when I heard the sound of tires crunching on the long dirt driveway. I marked my page and stood up. I wasn't expecting anyone. The village postman rarely drove all the way up the bluff, preferring to leave packages in the box by the main road. A modest, sensible gray sedan emerged from the tree line and parked behind my car. It wasn't the luxury SUV Sarah used to drive. It was the kind of car a receptionist at a dental office buys, used. The driver's side door opened. Sarah stepped out. She was wearing simple denim jeans and a plain white linen shirt. Her hair was pulled back into a messy clip. She looked tired, the deep, permanent exhaustion of a single mother fighting a grueling custody battle. But she did not look broken. The brittle, manicured entitlement that used to define her had been entirely weathered away. She stood by the car, looking at the stone cottage, looking at the wild ocean behind it, and finally looking at me. She did not rush forward. She did not assume she was welcome. She simply stood there, keeping her hands in her pockets, waiting for my permission to exist in my space. "Hello, Sarah," I said from the porch. "Hi, Mom," she replied, her voice soft, carrying over the sound of the wind. The back doors of the sedan opened. 2 young boys tumbled out onto the gravel. Leo, now 10, and Max, 7. They were taller. They were wearing faded T-shirts and sneakers scuffed with dirt. They froze when they saw me, suddenly shy, unsure of how to approach a grandmother they hadn't seen in nearly a year, a grandmother who no longer lived in a mansion filled with expensive toys, but in a small stone house at the edge of the world. "I know I didn't write to ask," Sarah said, taking a cautious step forward. "It was Mark's weekend, but he had a golf trip, so he dropped them with me at the last minute. The apartment gets so hot in the summer. I wanted them to see the ocean. I wanted to see you." She paused, swallowing hard. "If it's an intrusion, we'll go. We can drive down to the public beach in the village." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the exact spot where the invisible leash used to connect us, the leash she used to yank whenever she needed money, comfort, or a scapegoat. The leash was gone. We were just 2 women now, standing across from each other, separated by a gravel driveway and a lifetime of hard truths. "It is a long drive back to the village," I said quietly. Sarah exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for the entire 4-hour drive. "You may bring the boys onto the porch," I told her. I was just about to make iced tea. "But Sarah," she stopped, looking up at me. "You will stay at the motor lodge in town tonight," I said, my voice gentle but absolutely firm. "I do not have the space to host, and I enjoy my quiet evenings." 10 months ago, this boundary would have triggered a weeping tantrum. She would have accused me of not loving her, of rejecting her children, of being cruel. Today, she simply nodded. A genuine small smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I already booked a room," she said. She turned to the boys. "Go on," she encouraged them softly. "Go say hi to your grandmother." They walked up the wooden steps, hesitant at first, until I reached out and pulled them both into a hug. They smelled of sunscreen and warm car leather. It was a good smell. It was the smell of a childhood that was finally being managed without the poison of endless excess. Sarah walked up the steps behind them. She didn't try to hug me. She just stood beside me, looking out at the Atlantic. "It's beautiful here," she murmured. "It is very quiet," I agreed. We sat on the porch for 3 hours. I did not cook for her. I did not offer her money for the motor lodge. We drank iced tea, and we watched the boys throw smooth stones into the churning water below the bluff. She told me about her job. She told me Mark was engaged to a 25-year-old paralegal, and that the financial reality of maintaining 2 households was beginning to crack his smug exterior. She said it without malice. She said it like a woman who had simply observed a storm passing over someone else's house. When the sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, she stood up. "We should get to the lodge before dark," she said, calling the boys up from the rocks. She turned to me. "Thank you, Mom, for letting us stay this afternoon." "You are welcome, Sarah." She hesitated, her hand resting on the wooden railing of the porch. "I read about David in the papers." "I know," I said. "Do you think—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "Do you think he'll ever understand why you did it?" I looked at the fractured yellow mug sitting on the windowsill inside the cottage. I thought of the shattered burner phone resting in the iron trash bin. "No," I replied softly. "People who view the world purely as a resource to be consumed never understand the concept of a closed door. They only understand that they are hungry." Sarah nodded slowly. She understood. She had been hungry once, too. She gathered the boys, walked back to her sensible, used car, and drove away. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights disappear into the tree line, leaving me entirely alone with the sound of the sea.